Long before satellites scanned the sky and laboratories learned how to melt stone with controlled force, an ancient city is said to have vanished in a single morning, erased so completely that even its soil refused life for centuries afterward. Why would an entire region become barren overnight? Why do multiple civilizations, separated by distance and language, describe fire descending from the sky with the same unsettling precision? Why do ancient texts speak of heat that liquefied stone, winds that shattered bodies, and salt that poisoned the earth? Why have these accounts been dismissed as metaphor when the ground itself still bears scars that refuse to fade? Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself, and let's dive in. A clay tablet rests behind glass in a museum collection, small enough to fit in 2 hands, yet heavy with consequences that stretch across millennia. Its surface is crowded with wedge-shaped impressions pressed into wet earth by a scribe who could not have imagined microscopes, satellites, or nuclear physics. The tablet does not speak of gradual decline or political intrigue. It records annihilation. Cities erased not by hunger or siege, but by a force that arrived suddenly, overwhelming stone, flesh, and memory in a single violent sweep. The words describe a storm that was not weather, fire that did not behave like fire, and land so damaged that crops failed generation after generation, as if the soil itself had been wounded. The cities named were not obscure villages. They were the anchors of an early world, places where trade routes converged, where temples organized civic life, where writing itself was taught and preserved. The scribes who composed these laments belonged to the first literate civilization humanity ever produced. Writing for them was not ornament or art alone. It was accounting, law, medicine, astronomy, and memory made permanent. When they wrote about destruction, they did so with the same seriousness they used to record grain inventories or planetary movements. They had words for war, for siege, for famine, for plague. What they described here did not fit those categories. The text speaks of heat so intense that bricks softened and flowed, as if buildings had briefly forgotten they were solid. Pottery, normally brittle when exposed to fire, is described as altered, its surface transformed, its shape warped without shattering. This detail matters because ancient people were not ignorant of fire. They cooked with it, fired ceramics with it, destroyed enemy cities with it. A Bronze Age city burned by invaders leaves a familiar signature: charred beams, collapsed roofs, ash layers mixed with looted valuables gone missing. The Laments describe something else entirely, something closer to instantaneous ruin than prolonged destruction. Throughout the tablet runs a refrain of abandonment. The gods, it says, fled their temples. In Sumerian thought, a city was alive because its god lived there. When a god departed, order collapsed. This was not theology alone, but a way of explaining civic breakdown. If canals failed, if crops died, if law dissolved, it meant the divine presence that sustained the city had withdrawn. Yet even within this religious language, the text lingers on physical effects: bodies torn apart, animals perishing where they stood, roofs igniting before walls, an unseen force scattering people like loose grain. Salt appears again and again, not as seasoning or trade good, but as curse. Fields were covered in it. Water tasted bitter. Nothing would grow. In an agricultural civilization, this was a death sentence that outlasted any battle. A city might be rebuilt after conquest. Salinized land meant abandonment. The scribes knew this. Their words carry the weight of finality, of places not merely destroyed, but erased from the map of viable human settlement. For generations, scholars read these laments as ritual exaggeration, poetic attempts to convey grief through cosmic language. Ancient literature often framed political catastrophe as divine wrath. Kings lost favor with the gods. Enemies were instruments of punishment. Disasters became morality plays. This interpretation was comfortable because it kept the ancient world safely symbolic, its gods imaginary, its disasters metaphorical. But the earth itself began to complicate that comfort. Far to the west of Sumer, in the lowlands east of the Dead Sea, archaeologists uncovered a city that ended exactly the way the Laments described. It was not slowly abandoned. It did not show signs of siege engines or mass graves from warfare. Instead, a thick layer of ash and debris sealed the final moment of its existence like a photograph burned into the ground. The city had been large for its time, with massive fortifications, administrative buildings, and neighborhoods dense with life. Then, abruptly, there was nothing. The debris told a strange story. Pottery fragments showed one face vitrified, melted into glassy smoothness, while the opposite side remained unchanged, as if exposed to an intense heat pulse, lasting only fractions of a second. Mud bricks, made of clay and straw and meant to crumble under prolonged fire, had partially liquefied. Human bones were found not as skeletons but as fragments, scattered and broken in ways that suggested extreme force rather than decay. There was no evidence of starvation, disease, or drawn-out conflict. Whatever happened occurred too fast for fear to organize itself. Salt again appeared where it should not have been. Soil samples revealed concentrations high enough to kill crops, far beyond what normal flooding or irrigation mistakes would produce. The salt was not neatly layered, as in evaporation deposits, but dispersed, as if it had fallen from the sky, settling into cracks, pores, and cooling surfaces. This detail echoed the ancient texts with unsettling accuracy. The scribes wrote of land cursed beyond recovery. Archaeology found a region abandoned for centuries. The temptation to connect these dots is powerful, but it is also dangerous. History is full of coincidences elevated into certainty. Dates rarely align perfectly. Texts travel, mutate, and absorb imagery from older traditions. Yet the parallels resist easy dismissal. Both the written record and the physical record describe sudden destruction, extreme heat, airborne debris, and long-term environmental damage. Both emphasize that this was not war as people understood it. The ancient scribes framed the cause as decision. An assembly was held. A verdict was reached. Destruction was unleashed. This was how a society without physics explained catastrophe. Forces beyond human control were, by definition, divine. Today, we might reach for different explanations: atmospheric explosions, cosmic debris, rare but devastating natural events that do not leave neat craters. These explanations do not diminish the experience of those who lived through it. To them, the sky betrayed them, and the result was indistinguishable from judgment. What matters is not whether the scribes understood the mechanism, but that they recognized the anomaly. They knew this destruction was different. They knew it violated expectations. That is why they wrote it down, why they taught it to students, why they preserved it across generations. The Laments are not calm theological treatises. They are raw attempts to comprehend loss so complete it threatened the idea of permanence itself. In those lines pressed into clay, you can sense disbelief hardening into memory. Cities that had stood for centuries vanished in moments. Lives structured around routine and ritual were erased without warning. Survivors, if there were any close enough to witness but far enough to live, could only describe what they saw in the language available to them. Fire from above, wind that was not wind, land poisoned beyond healing. This is where myth begins, not as fiction, but as compression. Too much reality forced into too small a framework. Over time, explanations become stories, stories become symbols, symbols become moral lessons. But beneath them remains an event, singular and terrifying. Archaeology does not read morality. It reads layers, fractures, chemical signatures. And sometimes, unexpectedly, it seems to nod in agreement with voices 4,000 years old. The tablet does not ask to be believed. It asks to be remembered. Its final concern is not theology, but warning. This has happened before. It can happen again. Cities are not eternal. Civilization is not immune. The ground remembers even when people forget. And when memory and soil tell the same story, dismissing either becomes an act of faith rather than skepticism. The excavation began like countless others, with careful grids etched into dust and the slow, patient removal of soil measured in centimeters. The site rose above the surrounding plain as a broad, artificial hill, a tell formed by centuries of human occupation, piling one era atop another. From a distance, it looked inert, almost peaceful, but the ground concealed a moment of violence frozen in place. As layers were peeled back, the rhythm of normal urban life emerged first. Storage jars, hearths, floor surfaces polished by bare feet. Then, without warning, the pattern stopped. Walls ended abruptly, sliced off as if history itself had been severed. Streets led into chaos. A dense band of blackened material stretched across the site, nearly uniform in thickness, sealing everything beneath it. This was not the thin ash smear of a house fire or the patchy residue of warfare. It was a continuous horizon of destruction, a geological timestamp marking a single, catastrophic instant. Above it lay centuries of silence, a void where no one rebuilt, no one returned, no one even tried. The pottery told the story first, because ceramics remember heat in ways organic material cannot. Bronze Age vessels were made from local clay and fired in kilns that reached temperatures sufficient to harden but not transform. Their internal structure remained porous, their surfaces matte. At this site, thousands of shards from the same period showed something entirely different. The interiors looked normal, untouched, as if time had simply paused. The exteriors had melted into glossy, bubbled skins, warped like modern plastic exposed to a blowtorch. This combination is crucial. Gradual heating causes ceramics to crack as moisture expands and escapes. Long exposure darkens and weakens the clay. Here, there were no cracks, no signs of slow stress. The surface had liquefied instantly, then cooled before the heat could penetrate deeper. Experimental tests later showed that temperatures above 2,000 degrees Celsius, sustained for less than a second, could reproduce this effect. No known Bronze Age technology could achieve that, not in one workshop, let alone across an entire city. Mud brick, the backbone of ancient architecture, behaved just as strangely. Made from clay mixed with straw and dried in the sun, it is vulnerable to prolonged fire and water, but stable under normal conditions. In the destruction layer, bricks had partially flowed, their edges rounded, their surfaces glazed. Some had fused together, forming masses that looked more like volcanic rock than building material. Roof clay, once packed over wooden beams, had dripped downward as it softened, creating hardened stalactites where it cooled in mid-fall. The wood itself was gone, not burned into charcoal but vanished, leaving hollow impressions. Human remains were rare, and that rarity spoke volumes. In cities destroyed by war, bodies accumulate. In plagues, mass burials appear. Here, there were fragments, scattered pieces of bone with no complete skeletons. Joints were torn apart. Bones snapped not by decay or scavengers, but by force applied at the moment of death. The pattern matched what modern forensic science associates with explosive trauma. Death came faster than panic. People died where they stood, inside rooms, on streets, mid-task, with no sign of flight. Then there was the salt. Soil analysis revealed concentrations far beyond agricultural tolerance. In some areas, nearly a quarter of the sediment consisted of crystalline salt. This was not the slow creep of salinity from irrigation or the residue of evaporated standing water. The crystals varied in size and were embedded in cracks and pores, as if they had settled while surfaces were still hot and fractured. The distribution pattern suggested descent from above, heavier accumulation in low-lying areas, lighter coverage on elevated ground. This environmental poisoning explained something the architecture alone cannot: the long absence that followed. After the destruction, the region emptied, not for a generation, but for centuries. Nearby settlements within a wide radius were abandoned around the same time. Fields lay fallow not because people forgot how to farm, but because the land would not cooperate. Salt kills crops by drawing moisture out of plant roots, a slow, invisible sabotage. Wells would have tasted bitter. Livestock would have sickened. Survivors would have fled rather than starved. The uniformity of the destruction layer suggested a single event, not a series of attacks or disasters. The absence of weapons, siege ramps, or mass graves ruled out conventional warfare. Earthquakes can topple buildings, but they do not melt pottery or fragment bones in this way. Volcanic eruptions leave ash rich in certain minerals, but no such signatures appeared here. The site sat far from any volcanic system. The evidence pointed upward, not outward or inward. Directional clues reinforced this. Debris from individual vessels was scattered along consistent vectors, as if driven by a powerful wind moving in one dominant direction. Shards embedded themselves into walls and floors on the far sides of courtyards. Heavy architectural elements collapsed inward, compressed by force from above, rather than pushed outward from within. This pattern resembled the effects of a massive shock wave, the kind produced when energy is released in the atmosphere rather than at ground level. Such events are rare, but not unknown. In modern times, a mid-air explosion over Siberia flattened forests across hundreds of square kilometers without leaving a crater. Trees were knocked down in a radial pattern, their trunks scorched, their roots intact. Witnesses described a fireball, intense heat, and a blast that arrived seconds later, shattering windows hundreds of kilometers away. Scale that phenomenon down, place it over a populated Bronze Age valley, and the archaeological signatures begin to make sense. Yet archaeology does not operate on plausibility alone. It demands caution. Every claim invites challenge. Some researchers argued that high temperatures could be localized, that pottery might have been reheated in industrial contexts. Others suggested natural salt movement or later contamination. Scientific debate sharpened. Methods were scrutinized, conclusions revised. What remained unchanged was the physical reality. The city ended suddenly, violently, and in a way that defied normal categories. This is where ancient texts regain relevance, not as proof, but as context. When scribes described fire from the sky and land turned to salt, they were not performing chemistry. They were recording experience. Their language reflected what they saw and felt, filtered through belief. The match between their descriptions and the ground's testimony does not require literal gods or modern weapons. It requires only that humans, ancient and modern, witness catastrophe and struggle to explain it. The site stands today as a reminder that civilization's veneer is thin. Beneath routine and prosperity lies vulnerability to forces that do not negotiate. The people who lived there built walls thick enough to support towers, organized trade networks, governed complex societies. None of that mattered when the sky delivered something they could not anticipate or withstand. The destruction layer is silent, but it speaks clearly. It says this happened fast. It says heat came first, then force, then poison. It says memory outlived stone. And when placed beside those clay tablets written by grieving scribes, it suggests that myth and matter sometimes align not by accident, but because both are tracing the same scar left on human history. To understand why ancient witnesses described destruction as divine decree rather than accident, it is necessary to step inside the mental world they inhabited, a world where nature and intention were inseparable. For the people of early Mesopotamia, the universe was not governed by impersonal forces, but by will. Storms did not simply form, they were released. Floods did not just happen, they were sent. When something exceeded the scale of human violence, it could only belong to the realm of gods. This was not superstition in the modern sense, but a coherent explanatory system built from observation and memory. The scribes who wrote the Laments lived in a civilization that measured time, mapped stars, and recorded legal minutiae with obsessive care. Their mathematics used a base 60 system precise enough to calculate planetary cycles. Their astronomical records tracked eclipses and solstices centuries in advance. These were not people inclined to casual exaggeration. When they described something as unprecedented, it meant it lay outside known experience. War was familiar. Fire was familiar. Famine was tragically familiar. What they described in the Laments was none of these in isolation. The language they used reflects shock more than symbolism. They wrote of brightness that turned night into day, of heat that arrived before sound, of winds that carried death rather than rain. One term appears repeatedly, translated loosely as evil wind, but the word carries a physical meaning as well. It refers to a moving force that brings harm through contact, something breathed in, something that lingers. In modern terms, it evokes particulate matter suspended in air, invisible yet lethal. The scribes had no vocabulary for aerosols or pressure waves, but they recognized patterns: exposure, sickness, delayed death. They also noted sequence. Fire fell, then the wind followed. buildings ignited from above before collapsing. People died indoors, not on walls or roads. Animals perished alongside humans, not taken as spoils. This mattered because armies behaved differently. Victors looted livestock. Siege warfare left traces of prolonged struggle. Here, everything died at once. That simultaneity haunted the texts. It is why the destruction is framed as decree rather than battle. No human army could be everywhere at once. The divine council described in the Laments is often misunderstood as mythological theater, but it served a social function. In Mesopotamian theology, disasters required explanation that preserved cosmic order. If destruction was arbitrary, then the universe was unreliable. By portraying the gods as deliberating, arguing, even regretting their decision, the texts preserve a sense of causality. Something was decided, therefore something could, in theory, be prevented in the future. This is not resignation. It is an attempt to impose meaning on chaos. Archaeology adds a grim layer to this interpretation. The evidence suggests that whatever occurred did not discriminate. Wealth, status, piety offered no protection. Temples collapsed alongside houses. Palaces were crushed like ordinary dwellings. This universality of destruction undermines moral explanations, even as the texts attempt to assert them. The scribes insist the cities were doomed, yet their grief betrays disbelief. The gods are blamed, but the tone is mourning, not triumph. Environmental aftermath reinforced the sense of cosmic rupture. Land that had been fertile became hostile. In Mesopotamian thought, agriculture was a divine gift taught by the gods themselves. When fields failed, it implied withdrawal of favor at the deepest level. Salt-poisoned soil was not just economic loss, it was theological catastrophe. The Laments dwell on this because it meant the destruction was not temporary. It could not be fixed with labor or tribute. It was final. This perspective helps explain why similar language appears in later traditions, far from Mesopotamia. When communities encounter devastation that defies their frameworks, they reach for inherited metaphors. Fire from heaven, breath of the gods, curses that linger in the land. These are not borrowed stories so much as convergent expressions shaped by shared human limits. When modern readers encounter these accounts, the mistake is to assume metaphor first and observation second. Often it is the reverse. The physical record now visible in ruined cities supports that inversion. Extreme heat without prolonged burning. Structural collapse without siege. Mass death without burial. Environmental toxicity without flood markers. Each element alone could be explained away. Together, they form a signature that ancient observers recognized as abnormal, even if they misattributed its cause. Their attribution was the only one available to them. It is tempting to imagine that modern science would have saved them, that warning systems or engineering might have prevented such loss. This confidence dissolves quickly when considering how little notice some modern disasters provide. Atmospheric explosions give seconds, not days. Shockwaves do not negotiate. Even now, a city caught directly beneath such an event would fare little better, despite technology. This realization strips ancient accounts of their perceived naivety and replaces it with kinship. The scribes wrote not to impress gods, but to remember. Their tablets were teaching tools, copied in schools, recited aloud. Students learned not only language, but caution. The Laments warned that stability could be illusion. They encoded survival lessons in poetry because poetry endured. The fact that these texts survived while the cities did not is itself a lesson in resilience through memory. Over centuries, as populations moved and languages shifted, these memories transformed. Some became moral narratives, others cosmic myths. Details blurred, names changed, locations migrated in the telling. Yet core elements persisted: sudden fire, overwhelming wind, poisoned land, abandoned cities. When archaeology uncovers a site that matches this pattern with unnerving precision, it suggests continuity rather than coincidence. Understanding ancient interpretation does not require accepting ancient conclusions. One can reject divine causation while respecting ancient observation. The danger lies in dismissing both. The Laments are not scientific reports, but neither are they fantasy. They are human responses to a real event that exceeded comprehension. Their value lies in what they preserve unintentionally: sequence, sensation, consequence. When those clay tablets speak of cities consumed, they are not asking for belief. They are offering testimony. The ground beneath ruined settlements echoes that testimony in melted surfaces and shattered bones. Between them lies a dialogue across 4,000 years, one written in symbols, the other in minerals. Both insist on the same truth. Something happened that changed everything, and those who lived through it struggled, as humans always do, to name the unthinkable and live with what remained. The geography of the destruction matters as much as the destruction itself, because landscapes remember events in ways stories alone cannot. The Jordan Valley is a long, narrow depression carved by tectonic movement, a place where water, salt, and heat interact in unstable balance. To the ancient world, it was a paradox: lush in places, deadly in others, fed by a river yet bordered by one of the most saline bodies of water on Earth. Cities that thrived there did so by mastering that balance, controlling irrigation, trade, and movement along a corridor that linked continents. The city at the center of this catastrophe occupied a commanding position on the eastern side of the valley, elevated above the floodplain, yet close enough to the river to benefit from its resources. From its walls, one could see far across the plain, watch caravans approach, track seasonal changes in vegetation. It was not hidden or marginal. It was visible, strategic, and prosperous. Its size alone distinguished it from surrounding settlements. Thick fortifications, administrative buildings, and dense residential quarters marked it as a regional capital rather than a satellite town. This visibility becomes important when ancient descriptions mention witnesses watching destruction from a distance. A city set on higher ground would have been seen clearly from surrounding hills. Smoke rising from it would not have blended into the horizon. It would have dominated the view. In a world without artificial light, fire visible by day carried special significance. Dense columns of smoke signaled more than ordinary burning. They suggested something consuming everything at once. The Dead Sea lies only a short distance to the south, its surface nearly a kilometer below sea level, its waters saturated with minerals. In antiquity, bitumen floated to the surface and washed ashore, collected for construction and trade. The valley floor around it contained natural tar pits, sticky and flammable. Ancient texts mention these as geographic markers, not metaphors, because they were distinctive and economically important. Any violent event interacting with this environment would have consequences amplified by chemistry as much as by force. If extreme heat passed over the northern edge of the Dead Sea, Even briefly, it could have vaporized surface water, lofting mineral-rich aerosols into the air. As those particles cooled and fell, they would settle unevenly across the landscape, concentrating in low areas, infiltrating soil and structures. This mechanism aligns with the salt patterns found in the destruction layer. It also explains why contamination extended beyond a single city, affecting multiple settlements within a defined radius. The pattern of abandonment across the valley reinforces this view. Sites within roughly 25 kilometers show synchronized disruption. Occupation layers end abruptly. Rebuilding does not occur for centuries. This is not how political collapse behaves. Empires fall, but people move into the vacuum. Here, the vacuum persisted. The land itself became the barrier. In ecological terms, the valley entered a hostile phase, one not easily reversed without time and natural leaching. Ancient narratives preserve this transformation through stark imagery. A place once described as well-watered and fertile becomes a byword for desolation. Its name evolves from geography into metaphor, invoked whenever writers want to convey utter ruin. This shift from place to symbol only occurs when the physical reality is extreme enough to imprint itself on cultural memory. Mild disasters fade, absolute ones linger. Geography also complicates alternative explanations. Earthquakes occur along fault lines that run through the region, and historical records attest to devastating seismic events. Earthquakes can collapse buildings and alter landscapes, but their signatures differ. They leave tilted walls, crushed skeletons trapped beneath debris, patterns of collapse tied to ground movement. They do not generate the thermal effects observed here, nor do they salt the earth in a way that prevents recovery across centuries. Warfare, too, struggles to fit the geography. A coordinated campaign might destroy several cities, but armies require supply lines. They leave traces of camps, weapons, mass graves. They target strategic points, not indiscriminately flatten everything within a radius. And even the most ruthless conquerors prefer to exploit land, not render it unusable. The abandonment of the valley suggests a disaster that harmed conqueror and conquered alike. The idea of an atmospheric event gains traction when mapped onto this terrain. A mid-air explosion above the valley would funnel shockwaves along its length, amplifying force through the natural corridor. The surrounding highlands would receive less damage, consistent with patterns of survival and observation in ancient accounts. Wind direction, shaped by topography, would influence where debris and salt settled. Geography would act as both conduit and shield. This interplay between event and environment explains why memory localized the catastrophe so precisely. 5 cities clustered in a plain could be destroyed, while others beyond the rim survived. To ancient observers, this selectivity looked intentional. To modern eyes, it resembles physics constrained by terrain. The valley did not merely host the event, it shaped it. Understanding this does not strip the story of its power. It deepens it. The people who built their lives there chose the valley for its fertility and connectivity, accepting its risks because the rewards were great. For generations, that choice paid off. Then, in a moment beyond prediction, the very features that sustained life amplified destruction. Water became poison. Trade routes became empty. Elevated ground offered no protection. The archaeological record preserves this pivot with brutal clarity. Before the destruction, the valley hums with activity. After, it falls silent. When people eventually return, they do so cautiously, in smaller numbers, avoiding previous centers. Memory guided behavior long after eyewitnesses were gone. Stories warned where the ground was treacherous, where prosperity had turned lethal. This is the deeper significance of geography in the narrative. It bridges text and artifact, showing how environment mediates catastrophe and memory alike. Ancient writers did not need seismographs or chemical assays to know their land had betrayed them. They encoded that knowledge in story. Modern science decodes it in layers of ash and salt. Together, they reveal a landscape scarred not just by a single event, but by the knowledge of it. The valley carries that scar forward, a reminder that place matters, that where we build shapes how we fall. Cities rise where conditions allow, but those same conditions can magnify ruin when balance breaks. The ground remembers, and through it, so do we. Time does not erase catastrophe. It reshapes it. As generations pass, raw memory hardens into narrative, and narrative bends to the needs of those who inherit it. In the centuries following the destruction of the valley cities, survivors scattered. Some crossed rivers, others climbed into hill country, carrying with them fragments of experience too heavy to discard. They did not bring artifacts or maps. They brought stories, repeated until they became anchors of identity. This is how a local disaster becomes a foundational warning. In oral cultures, memory survives by compression. Events are distilled into images vivid enough to resist decay. Fire from the sky, wind that kills, land that turns against its people. These are not decorative elements. They are mnemonic devices, designed to ensure accuracy through repetition. A story that fails to grip the listener fails to survive. The more extreme the imagery, the more likely it is to be preserved intact. This explains why catastrophic accounts endure while mundane history dissolves. When these memories entered written tradition centuries later, they encountered new pressures. Writing fixes language, but not meaning. Scribes recorded what they received, but they also shaped it, aligning inherited memories with contemporary concerns. In later traditions, the destroyed cities become moral exemplars, their fate linked to human behavior rather than environmental chance. This shift reflects the needs of settled societies seeking ethical order. Catastrophe becomes a lesson, warning against excess, injustice, or defiance. Yet even as interpretation evolves, certain details remain stubbornly consistent. Fire descends rather than spreads. Destruction is instantaneous rather than gradual. Survivors escape only by fleeing early and without hesitation. The land itself becomes hostile, not temporarily damaged but fundamentally altered. These elements persist because they are grounded in observation, not ideology. They are difficult to reinterpret without losing coherence. The transformation of memory into scripture does not nullify its historical core. It reframes it. In theological texts, divine agency replaces physical explanation, but sequence and effect remain. The sky delivers destruction. Smoke rises like a furnace. Salt marks the aftermath. These are not abstract metaphors for moral decay. They describe a specific experience filtered through belief. Belief provided meaning where understanding failed. Archaeology enters this process not as arbiter of faith, but as counterpoint to memory. It does not read intention. It reads consequence. When it uncovers cities abandoned for centuries, soils rendered infertile, structures deformed by extreme heat, It validates the scale of the event without endorsing its explanation. This tension between memory and matter is productive. It forces humility on both sides. Text without ground drifts into myth. Ground without text risks silence. The persistence of the destruction narrative across cultures suggests more than borrowing. Neighboring civilizations shared trade, conflict, and climate. They also shared exposure to the same regional disasters. A catastrophic event affecting one valley would ripple outward through refugees, disrupted commerce, and altered landscapes. Stories would travel with people, adapting to new languages while retaining their emotional core. Over time, parallels emerge not because one text copied another, but because they originate in shared trauma. This helps explain why similar imagery appears in distant traditions. Fire from heaven, poisoned land, cities erased overnight. These motifs recur because they describe experiences at the limits of human control. When faced with annihilation, cultures reach for the same explanatory tools: agency, judgment, cosmic imbalance. The specifics differ, but the structure remains. Memory preserves the event. Belief explains it. Modern readers often struggle with this fusion. Trained to separate fact from interpretation, they are tempted to discard both when they cannot be cleanly divided. But ancient texts do not operate under modern epistemology. They are layered documents, preserving data and meaning together. Extracting one while rejecting the other risks misunderstanding both. The challenge is not to literalize belief or dismiss observation, but to recognize how they coexist. The story of the destroyed valley cities demonstrates this coexistence vividly. Archaeology confirms sudden destruction and long-term abandonment. Texts preserve sensory details and emotional response. Together they outline an event of extraordinary magnitude. The cause remains debated, but the effect is undeniable. A thriving region ceased to function as a human habitat. That fact shaped migration, economy, and belief for centuries. Memory of the event also shaped caution. Later settlements avoided certain areas or built differently. Stories warned against complacency. They encoded environmental knowledge in moral language because morality travels more easily than geology. A tale about divine judgment is easier to remember than a lecture on atmospheric physics. The result is a durable warning system, imperfect but effective. This durability is visible in how names survive. Cities vanish, but their names persist as symbols. Invoked in speeches, prayers, and texts, they detach from geography and attach to meaning. They become shorthand for total ruin. This semantic shift only occurs when the original destruction is overwhelming enough to eclipse normal history. Mild disasters produce footnotes. Absolute ones produce archetypes. Understanding this process reframes the question of accuracy. The issue is not whether every detail aligns with modern reconstruction, but whether the core experience matches the evidence. In this case, it does. Sudden annihilation, extreme heat, environmental poisoning, long-term abandonment. These are not literary inventions. They are physical realities etched into soil and stone. The evolution of the narrative also reveals human resilience. Survivors did not simply flee and forget. They carried memory forward, reshaping it to serve new contexts. They warned their children not through data, but through story. They ensured that what happened would not vanish with the ruins. This act of preservation is itself a response to trauma, a refusal to let loss be meaningless. In this light, the ancient accounts are not primitive misunderstandings, but sophisticated adaptations. They translate an incomprehensible event into a framework that sustains community and caution. They sacrifice precision for survival. Archaeology now restores some of that precision, not to replace the stories, but to deepen them. The cities are gone. The people are dust. What remains is a dialogue between memory and matter, between what was felt and what is found. Each corrects the other. Each preserves what the other cannot. And together they remind us that catastrophe does not end with destruction. It continues in how it is remembered, interpreted, and carried forward, shaping worlds long after the fire has faded from the sky. Scientific debate rarely unfolds in clean lines. It advances through friction, revision, and discomfort, especially when evidence challenges familiar explanations. The destruction of the Valley City forced such discomfort because it sat at the intersection of archaeology, geology, and cultural memory. Each discipline approached the site with different expectations, and the evidence refused to settle neatly into any single framework. What emerged instead was a layered argument about heat, force, and time. Geologists were drawn first to the minerals. Quartz grains recovered from the destruction layer showed microscopic fractures that caught attention because quartz behaves predictably under stress. Its crystal lattice is stable until subjected to pressures so extreme that the structure deforms faster than atoms can realign. Under a microscope, these deformations appear as narrow, planar features slicing through the grain. On Earth, only a few processes generate such conditions: meteor impacts, nuclear detonations, and certain high-energy explosions. Ordinary fires, even intense ones, do not qualify. Initial reports suggested that some grains exhibited these features, implying exposure to pressures far beyond anything humans could produce in the Bronze Age. This claim carried enormous implications, and with them came scrutiny. Other specialists examined the same samples and argued that the features were ambiguous, that they pinched and curved instead of remaining perfectly parallel, that they could be produced by tectonic stress or thermal shock. The disagreement did not erase the anomalies. It highlighted how difficult it is to read ancient trauma in mineral form. At the same time, materials scientists focused on melt products. Glassy coatings on pottery and brick resembled substances formed when silicate materials are heated so rapidly that they liquefy before structural collapse. In modern contexts, similar glass forms at nuclear test sites and meteor impact zones. The chemistry of the glass matters. Ratios of elements, the presence of exotic minerals, and cooling patterns all serve as fingerprints. Some matched expectations for high-energy events. Others could be explained by remelting of ceramics or industrial waste. The line between extraordinary and mundane blurred under magnification. Atmospheric scientists entered the conversation with models. They simulated what would happen if a dense object entered the atmosphere at high speed and disintegrated before impact. Such an airburst releases energy downward in a hemispheric shockwave, producing extreme heat and wind over a concentrated area without excavating a crater. Modeling suggested that temperatures and pressures consistent with the archaeological evidence were plausible under specific conditions: angle of entry, velocity, altitude of detonation. Small changes altered outcomes dramatically. Precision mattered, and certainty remained elusive. Critics pointed out that models are not events. They rely on assumptions, boundary conditions, and incomplete data. An airburst powerful enough to devastate a city would likely leave regional signatures detectable elsewhere. Supporters countered that erosion, sedimentation, and later human activity could obscure such traces. The debate did not resolve the question. It refined it. The issue was no longer whether something extraordinary happened, but what category of extraordinary best fit the evidence. Salt distribution returned to center stage because it bridged disciplines. Chemists analyzed its composition and grain size. Geographers mapped its spread. Ecologists assessed its impact on soil recovery. The conclusion converged on one point. The salt arrived suddenly and widely. Slow processes could not account for its penetration into sealed contexts or its concentration patterns. Something lofted it into the air and let it fall back across the landscape. Whether that something was a vaporized lake surface or another mechanism remained contested, but the suddenness was clear. The long abandonment of the valley added weight. Human societies are resilient when land remains productive. They rebuild after war and quake. They adapt after flood. They do not abandon fertile corridors for half a millennium without compelling reason. Environmental toxicity offers such a reason. It operates invisibly, undermining every attempt to re-establish stability. Failed harvests lead to migration. Migration erodes memory of place. Over time, the land becomes a warning rather than a home. Skeptics cautioned against letting ancient texts influence interpretation of physical data. Confirmation bias is a known hazard. Researchers are human, susceptible to narrative. Yet complete isolation of disciplines carries its own risk. Ignoring historical testimony can lead to misreading context. The challenge lay in maintaining tension without collapse, allowing evidence to speak without forcing it to agree. This tension mirrored the ancient struggle to explain the event. They lacked instruments but possessed perception. They recorded what they could. Sequence, scale, aftermath. Modern science supplies tools but lacks witnesses. It reconstructs from fragments, infers from patterns. Neither approach is sufficient alone. Together, they approach coherence. As debate continued, retractions and revisions became part of the story. Some claims were withdrawn, methodologies questioned, conclusions softened. This did not invalidate the site. It demonstrated the self-correcting nature of inquiry. Science advances by admitting uncertainty, not by clinging to first impressions. The destruction remained real. Its cause remained open. What persisted through argument was the recognition that the event exceeded normal parameters. It was not routine fire. It was not typical warfare. It was not gradual decline. It was sudden, energetic, and transformative. Any explanation must account for all these features simultaneously. Partial explanations fail because the evidence is integrated. Heat, force, and chemistry intersected in a single moment. This integrated nature is what makes the site unsettling. It resists compartmentalization. It invites speculation while punishing certainty. Each proposed cause solves some problems and creates others. An airburst explains heat and shock, but raises questions about rarity and precision. Seismic activity explains collapse, but not vitrification. Human action explains intent, but not capability. The absence of a perfect fit does not imply fabrication. It implies complexity. In that complexity lies the true value of the site. It reminds us that past events do not conform to modern categories. Nature operates on a spectrum wider than our experience. Human history intersects with that spectrum unpredictably. When it does, memory and matter capture different facets of the same reality. The scientific debate, ongoing and unresolved, echoes the ancient laments in an unexpected way. Both acknowledge limits. The scribes attributed cause to gods because no better explanation existed. Scientists argue over models because certainty remains out of reach. Both are responses to the same provocation, evidence of a moment when ordinary rules failed. What remains is humility. The valley teaches caution against premature conclusions, whether theological or technological. It invites patience, comparison, and respect for ambiguity. The destruction happened. Its imprint endures. Understanding it fully may remain beyond reach, but grappling with it sharpens our awareness of how fragile human systems are when confronted with forces that arrive without warning and leave nothing untouched. Beyond the shattered walls and melted stone lies another record of catastrophe, one not preserved in minerals but in language that traveled across borders and centuries. Ancient civilizations rarely existed in isolation. Trade routes carried copper, grain, and textiles, but they also carried stories. When a disaster reshaped an entire region, its echo moved with merchants, refugees, and diplomats, embedding itself into multiple traditions at once. This is how a single event can leave impressions in texts that appear, at first glance, unrelated. In Mesopotamia, the Laments focused on loss and abandonment, on gods withdrawing and cities falling silent. In later Levantine traditions, the same type of destruction acquired moral framing. Fire from the sky became judgment. Survival became obedience. These differences reflect cultural priorities rather than divergent memories. Each society shaped the event into a narrative that reinforced its worldview, but the skeleton of the story remained recognizable. Common elements recur with striking consistency. Multiple cities destroyed simultaneously, fire descending rather than spreading. A wind that carried devastation beyond the initial impact, survivors escaping only by distance or early flight, land rendered uninhabitable long after the flames died. These motifs do not arise randomly. They cluster around specific types of experience, particularly those involving rapid, high-energy phenomena unfamiliar to everyday life. When texts from different cultures preserve the same cluster, the probability of shared origin increases. This does not require direct copying. It requires proximity in time and space to the same trauma. The ancient Near East was interconnected enough for such diffusion. A caravan route could transmit news faster than rebuilding could occur. Stories would travel ahead of refugees, preparing listeners for what they would see or had already heard. The language used to describe these events often borrows from warfare because war was the most destructive force people knew. Gods wield weapons, storms march like armies, cities are assaulted from above. Yet the texts frequently insist that no human enemy was involved. This insistence is important. It signals an awareness that the destruction exceeded military norms. Writers reached for martial imagery not because it fit perfectly, but because no better metaphor existed. One Babylonian composition describes weapons that produce blinding light and winds that flatten landscapes. Another mentions residues that poison fields and water. In isolation, these lines could be dismissed as hyperbole. In context, alongside archaeological evidence of heat, shock, and salinization, they take on a different weight. They read less like fantasy and more like attempts to catalog unfamiliar effects. The same pattern appears in later biblical narratives. The emphasis is not on battle, but on suddenness. There is no prolonged siege, no exchange of blows. Destruction arrives as a verdict, instantaneous and overwhelming. Smoke rises like a furnace, a detail that suggests forced draft and sustained combustion beyond ordinary fires. The aftermath is final. The cities are not rebuilt. Their names become warnings. These texts also preserve geographic specificity. Valleys, plains, and trade routes are named. Distances are implied through travel times and lines of sight. Such details are unnecessary for pure myth. They matter only if listeners are expected to recognize real places. Over time, some locations blur, but core spatial relationships persist. This persistence anchors the narrative in lived geography. Critics often argue that ancient authors retrojected familiar disasters onto moral frameworks, reshaping memory to serve ideology. This undoubtedly occurred. Yet ideology alone does not explain the technical consistency across traditions. Moral lessons vary. Physical descriptions converge. Fire from heaven appears in cultures with very different theologies. Salted land appears in regions where salinity was not otherwise symbolic. These overlaps suggest shared observation rather than shared doctrine. Cultural memory also tends to simplify, not complicate. Over generations, stories lose detail. Yet the accounts of this destruction retain complexity, sequence, aftermath, environmental change. Such persistence implies reinforcement by reality. People returning to ruined landscapes would see the same features their ancestors described. The story remained relevant because the land confirmed it. This convergence extends beyond the Near East. Other ancient traditions describe cities destroyed by celestial fire or divine weapons that leave lasting desolation. While not all can be tied to the same event, they reveal a human tendency to encode rare, high-impact experiences in durable narrative forms. When nature behaves in ways that mimic intent, cultures attribute intent. The result is myth grounded in memory. Modern scholarship often separates text and artifact, assigning primacy to one and suspicion to the other. The destruction of the valley challenges this separation. Neither alone tells the full story. Text preserves sequence and meaning. Artifact preserves scale and mechanism. Together, they triangulate an event that would otherwise remain ambiguous. This triangulation does not yield certainty. It yields plausibility. It narrows the field of explanation. It suggests that ancient accounts, while theologically framed, are not inventions ex nihilo. They are refracted memories of something that happened and left scars deep enough to persist across millennia. Understanding this requires a shift in how ancient literature is read. Instead of asking whether it is true or false, it is more productive to ask what experience generated it. What did people see, feel, lose, and fear? When those questions are asked, the texts become less alien and more human. They are not claims about physics. They are testimonies about survival. The valley's destruction thus occupies a liminal space between myth and science. It resists reduction to either. It reminds us that ancient people were observers first and interpreters second. They recorded what overwhelmed them using the only language available. We inherit their words stripped of context and risk mistaking metaphor for imagination rather than translation. The convergence of multiple traditions around the same destructive pattern strengthens the case for a real event with regional impact. It suggests that memory, when reinforced by environment, can endure astonishingly well. The cities fell, the land changed, people remembered. Their memories traveled, adapted, and endured, leaving traces not just in soil, but in story. In this light, the ancient accounts are not obstacles to understanding, but guides. They point toward where to look and what to consider. They caution against assuming that the past was simpler or less observant than the present. And they remind us that when catastrophe strikes at a scale beyond comprehension, humanity's first response is not analysis, but remembrance, carried forward in words that refuse to let the event vanish into silence. The human response to sudden annihilation does not end with flight or grief. It continues in adaptation. After the valley fell silent, life did not stop in the surrounding regions. It shifted. Archaeological surveys in neighboring highlands show subtle but telling changes in settlement patterns during the centuries that followed. Small communities appeared in areas previously marginal, places less fertile but safer, less exposed to the forces that had erased the lowland cities. These movements were not random. They reflected learned caution encoded through memory. Material culture changed alongside geography. Pottery styles simplified, trade goods diminished, and architecture became less ambitious. Where once there had been multi-story administrative centers, there were now modest dwellings clustered for mutual support. This contraction is not evidence of cultural decline in the moral sense, but of recalibration. People adjusted their expectations of permanence. Monumentality gave way to survivability. The trauma of sudden loss reshaped priorities. Such periods are often labeled dark ages, but darkness here refers to absence of records, not absence of life. The archaeological record becomes thinner because societies invest less in durable expression and more in immediate continuity. Writing declines not because knowledge is lost, but because resources and stability are insufficient to sustain scribal institutions. Oral tradition fills the gap, preserving what matters most: warnings, boundaries, lessons paid for with lives. This context reframes later narratives that emerge centuries afterward. When texts describe ancestral catastrophes, they are not merely recalling ancient history. They are encoding survival strategies. The insistence on obedience, on heeding warnings, on not lingering when danger appears, reflects practical wisdom born of experience. The stories are ethical on the surface and ecological beneath. They teach how to live in a world where the ground itself can turn hostile. Archaeology supports this reading through absence as much as presence. The long gap in valley occupation is not simply empty time. It is time filled with avoidance. People remembered where not to build. Memory acted as an invisible boundary shaping land use. Only after centuries of natural processes reduced soil salinity did cautious resettlement begin, and even then at smaller scales. The ancient capital was never restored to its former status. Memory outweighed opportunity. This persistence of avoidance demonstrates the power of transmitted experience. It challenges assumptions that oral societies quickly forget. Instead, they remember selectively, preserving information critical to survival while discarding detail that no longer serves. The destruction of the valley was not remembered as a date or statistic. It was remembered as a place to fear, a story to heed. That memory proved accurate enough to guide behavior for generations. The interplay between trauma and adaptation also explains why later writers framed the catastrophe in absolute terms. Total destruction serves as a clear signal. Partial destruction invites experimentation. By portraying the event as final and divinely sanctioned, narratives discouraged return. They protected communities from repeating fatal choices. In this sense, theology functioned as environmental regulation, enforced through belief rather than law. Modern readers often underestimate this function because they separate religion from pragmatism. In ancient contexts, the two were intertwined. A command attributed to divine authority carried weight precisely because it was unquestionable. It ensured compliance across generations that might otherwise doubt inherited caution. This mechanism preserved safety in the absence of scientific explanation. The archaeological record also hints at psychological effects. Sudden catastrophic events leave marks not only on landscapes but on collective behavior. Increased emphasis on kinship, hospitality, and mutual obligation appears in material and textual records following regional disasters. These social adaptations increase resilience. They emerge not from abstract ethics, but from lived necessity. When survival depends on cooperation, stories reinforce cooperation. The valley catastrophe thus occupies a pivotal place in regional history. It marks a transition from expansion to contraction, from confidence to caution. It altered trade routes, redirected populations, and reshaped belief systems. These changes did not occur because people understood the cause. They occurred because people understood the risk. Cause mattered less than consequence. This distinction is crucial when evaluating ancient explanations. The accuracy of divine causation is irrelevant to the effectiveness of the response. People avoided the valley. They warned their descendants. They survived. In evolutionary terms, the narrative succeeded. It transmitted actionable knowledge across time without requiring technical understanding. Archaeology reveals the cost of ignoring such knowledge. Regions that resumed intensive settlement too quickly suffered repeated failures. Crops failed. Wells proved undrinkable. Structures deteriorated. These setbacks reinforced memory, creating feedback between experience and story. Over time, the land itself taught caution, but the stories ensured the lesson was not forgotten during periods of apparent recovery. The gradual return to the valley centuries later reflects another adaptive shift. As environmental conditions improved and memory faded, opportunity reasserted itself. New generations, further removed from the trauma, tested old boundaries. They rebuilt cautiously, often in different locations, with different scales and strategies. The ancient capital remained a ruin, a visible reminder of limits. This pattern repeats throughout human history. Catastrophe resets ambition. Recovery tempers it. Forgetting invites repetition. The valley's story encapsulates this cycle in concentrated form. Its ruins stand as punctuation in the long sentence of regional development, marking where continuity broke and had to be rewritten. Understanding this cycle deepens appreciation of ancient texts. They are not static doctrines, but living tools shaped by experience. Their moral framing is secondary to their function. They preserve memory where material traces erode. They guide behavior where direct observation is no longer possible. In this sense, archaeology and narrative complete each other. Excavation uncovers what happened. Story explains how people lived with it. Neither alone conveys the full impact. Together, they reveal a society learning, painfully, that stability is conditional and that survival depends as much on remembering where not to go as on knowing where to build. The valley's destruction did not end a civilization. It redirected it. The absence it created became a teacher, shaping choices long after flames and winds were gone. That lesson, encoded in soil and story alike, endures as one of humanity's oldest adaptations to a world capable of sudden, uncompromising change. As centuries layered themselves over the ruins, another transformation took place, one less visible than collapsed walls, yet equally consequential. The catastrophe became a reference point, a benchmark against which later crises were measured. In texts written long after the valley had emptied, authors invoked its destruction not to describe geology or history, but to define limits. It became the extreme case, the scenario beyond which no comparison was needed. This rhetorical role reveals how deeply the event penetrated cultural consciousness. When later writers spoke of judgment, they did not need to explain what judgment looked like. The image was already fixed: fire from above, sudden erasure, land rendered sterile. These phrases functioned as shorthand because audiences understood them instinctively. The original event had been absorbed so completely that it no longer required elaboration. This absorption marks a transition from memory to archetype. The catastrophe ceased to be just something that happened. It became a conceptual tool. Archetypes endure because they are versatile. They can be applied to new situations without losing power. Political collapse, moral failure, military defeat could all be described through the same imagery, even if their causes differed. The original valley disaster provided the template. Its severity granted authority to the metaphor. Lesser events borrowed its language to amplify their significance. In this way, the past shaped how the present was understood. This process often obscures origins. Over time, the archetype feels timeless, detached from any specific place. Modern readers encountering these later texts may assume the imagery was always symbolic. Archaeology challenges that assumption by restoring context. It reminds us that behind the symbol lies an event so disruptive that it demanded permanent linguistic representation. The same dynamic appears in how ancient law codes and prophetic writings employ the imagery. Threats of destruction are framed not as abstract punishment, but as repetition. Do this, and what happened there will happen here. The power of the warning depends on shared knowledge of the reference point. Without the original catastrophe, the threat would lack teeth. Its continued use indicates that the memory remained active and credible. Material culture reflects this credibility indirectly. Sites in the broader region show patterns of defensive planning and resource management that suggest heightened awareness of vulnerability. Storage facilities increase in importance. Settlements favor locations with multiple escape routes. These choices may not directly reference the ancient disaster, but they align with a worldview shaped by awareness that annihilation can arrive without warning. Even cosmology absorbs the lesson. The heavens, once primarily sources of order and guidance, acquire a dual aspect. Celestial bodies still mark time and seasons, but they also carry potential threat. Eclipses, comets, and unusual atmospheric phenomena are recorded with anxiety. The sky is no longer neutral. It is capable of delivering both blessing and ruin. This ambivalence reflects lived experience encoded in belief. The valley disaster thus contributes to a subtle shift in how humans perceive their relationship to the environment. Instead of viewing nature as stable backdrop occasionally disrupted by divine whim, it becomes an active participant in human fate. This realization does not produce modern environmentalism, but it fosters caution. It tempers assumptions of permanence. It introduces humility into ambition. Later civilizations inherit this posture even when they forget its origin. They build myths around floods, fires, and falling stars, not because they expect them daily, but because they know they are possible. The myths serve as reminders of contingency. They assert that no society, however advanced, is immune to forces beyond its control. Archaeology provides a counterbalance to romantic interpretations of this inheritance. It shows that awareness does not guarantee preparedness. Despite memory, societies continue to cluster in fertile but risky environments. They accept danger for prosperity. The difference lies in how they rationalize that choice. The ancient valley cities were not ignorant of risk. They lived with it, balancing reward against threat. Their destruction did not eliminate the impulse, it recalibrated it. The archaeological silence that follows the catastrophe speaks to this recalibration. People did not immediately rush back when the flames cooled. They waited, watched, and remembered. This pause is evidence of learning. It suggests that the event altered not just belief, but behavior. That alteration persisted long enough to shape regional development. Over time, as generations passed and memory thinned, the archetype outlived the lesson. Stories remained vivid, but their practical implications faded. The valley slowly re-entered human use, though never reclaiming its former centrality. The archetype remained powerful in language, even as its geographic referent blurred. This divergence between symbol and site is common in long-lived cultures. Understanding this divergence helps modern interpreters avoid false dichotomies. The ancient accounts are neither literal scientific reports nor pure allegory. They are layered responses to experience, evolving as societies changed. Archaeology anchors the earliest layer. Later texts elaborate upon it. Both are necessary to reconstruct the full trajectory. The valley's story thus extends beyond its physical boundaries. It becomes part of a broader human conversation about fragility. It informs how disasters are framed, remembered, and anticipated. It shapes expectations about divine justice, natural order, and human limitation. Its influence is disproportionate to its geographic size because its impact was absolute. In the end, what survives is not certainty about cause, but clarity about effect. A region thrived, was erased, and remained empty long enough to imprint itself on memory. That memory became archetype. The archetype shaped language, belief, and behavior across cultures and centuries. Archaeology, by reopening the ground, reconnects the archetype to its source. This reconnection does not demystify the past, it deepens it. It reveals how human beings transform trauma into meaning and meaning into structure. It shows how an event can outgrow itself, becoming larger in memory than in space. And it reminds us that beneath our most enduring symbols often lies a moment when the world, quite literally, fell apart. Modern fascination with the valley's destruction often gravitates toward extreme explanations, not because evidence demands them, but because the event itself feels extreme. When ordinary categories fail, imagination fills the gap. This tendency is not new. Ancient scribes attributed the catastrophe to divine assemblies and celestial weapons. Contemporary audiences reach for asteroids, secret technologies, or lost civilizations. The impulse is the same: to match cause with effect in emotional scale. One such line of speculation interprets ancient descriptions through the lens of modern warfare, particularly nuclear detonations. The parallels are superficially compelling. Instantaneous heat, blinding light, shockwaves that shatter bodies, landscapes rendered uninhabitable. Even the formation of glass from melted sand has modern analogues in nuclear test sites. These similarities provoke discomfort because they collapse temporal distance. They suggest that effects once considered uniquely modern may have occurred long before modernity existed. Scholars overwhelmingly reject the idea of ancient nuclear warfare, and with good reason. No consistent evidence of radioactive isotopes has been found at the site. No delivery systems, no technological infrastructure, no global fallout layer marks the period. Ancient texts do not describe sickness patterns consistent with radiation exposure. The theory relies on selective radon and anachronism, imposing contemporary fears onto ancient words. Its popularity says more about modern anxiety than ancient reality. Yet dismissing the theory entirely does not eliminate the unease that fuels it. The discomfort arises because the destruction exhibits features associated with very high-energy events, and such events remain rare in human experience. Whether caused by cosmic debris, atmospheric phenomena, or something else, the effect sits near the upper limit of what human societies have endured. When people sense proximity to that limit, they reach for language that conveys existential threat. This psychological dimension matters. It explains why explanations drift toward the dramatic. It also explains why ancient accounts framed the event as intentional. Randomness is harder to accept than purpose when loss is total. The mind seeks agency because agency implies predictability. If something was decided, it might be avoided next time. If it was random, safety becomes illusion. Scientific caution resists this impulse. It insists on proportionality between evidence and conclusion. In the case of the valley, science offers models rather than verdicts. Atmospheric airbursts provide one such model, capable of generating extreme heat and pressure without leaving a crater. They are rare but documented. Their effects can resemble those of nuclear explosions without sharing their origin. This explanation satisfies many data points while avoiding technological improbabilities. Even so, the airburst model leaves unanswered questions. Why here? Why then? Why such concentrated impact? Probability allows for chance, but human intuition struggles with accepting that thousands died simply because of location and timing. Ancient narratives solved this by invoking judgment. Modern speculation sometimes replaces gods with advanced beings or hidden technologies. Both responses attempt to impose narrative coherence on randomness. Archaeology remains indifferent to narrative preference. It records what happened, not why it feels unsatisfying. Melted pottery does not care whether its heat source was cosmic or artificial. Fragmented bones do not testify to intention. Salted soil does not encode motive. These materials constrain explanation, but do not complete it. They define boundaries within which imagination must operate. This boundary setting is valuable. It prevents speculation from drifting into fantasy. It grounds discussion in measurable reality. At the same time, it acknowledges that some questions may remain open. Science is comfortable with provisional answers. It does not require closure to function. This stance contrasts with cultural narratives that demand meaning. The tension between these approaches mirrors the ancient-modern divide in interpretation. Ancient societies privileged meaning over mechanism. Modern science privileges mechanism over meaning. Neither alone addresses the full human response to catastrophe. The valley's destruction sits at their intersection, forcing dialogue. Recognizing this helps diffuse sensationalism without dismissing curiosity. It allows us to say that while ancient nuclear war is unsupported, the event was nonetheless extraordinary. It allows us to appreciate why people reach for extreme explanations without endorsing them. It reframes speculation as symptom rather than solution. The persistence of such theories also reflects mistrust in gradualism. Many modern historical narratives emphasize slow change, incremental development, and systemic causation. Sudden, overwhelming events disrupt this framework. They remind us that history is not always shaped by trends. Sometimes it is shaped by moments. The valley represents one such moment, and moments resist comfortable categorization. Understanding this resistance encourages intellectual humility. It cautions against overconfidence in any single explanation. It invites interdisciplinary conversation rather than disciplinary conquest. Geology, archaeology, anthropology, and textual studies each contribute pieces. None dominates. In this collaborative space, the most responsible position acknowledges uncertainty while respecting evidence. It recognizes that the destruction was real, sudden, and transformative. It accepts that its cause, while constrained by data, may never be fully resolved. It resists the urge to replace ancient myth with modern myth. The true lesson lies not in identifying a perfect cause, but in understanding impact. The valley's destruction altered settlement patterns, belief systems, and cultural memory for centuries. It shaped how people understood vulnerability. It influenced how societies warned future generations. It left scars that archaeology still reads and stories still echo. By focusing on impact rather than spectacle, the narrative returns to human scale. Thousands of lives ended abruptly, communities dissolved, knowledge was lost, memory became the only continuity. Whether the heat came from sky or stone matters less than how people lived afterward. Modern fascination with catastrophic explanations reveals a mirror. We are drawn to extremes because we recognize our own fragility. We see in the ancient valley a reflection of fears about our cities, our technologies, our assumptions of control. The past becomes a canvas onto which we project present anxieties. Archaeology gently pulls us back. It reminds us that the ancient world was neither magical nor ignorant. It was observant, adaptive, and resilient within limits. When those limits were breached, people responded with the tools they had: story, ritual, memory. We are not so different. The valley's destruction does not require extraordinary conspiracies to be extraordinary. It stands on its own as a reminder that rare events, when they occur, reshape history disproportionately. Accepting that reality is less sensational but more sobering. In the end, the most unsettling aspect of the catastrophe is not how it happened, but how easily it could happen again, through different mechanisms, but with similar consequences. That realization, shared across millennia, is what gives the ancient accounts their enduring power and keeps modern speculation alive, even as evidence demands restraint. What endures after catastrophe is not only rubble and memory, but transformation in how societies think about time itself. Before the valley's destruction, the future was assumed to resemble the past, seasons repeating, harvests returning, cities growing layer by layer. Afterward, continuity could no longer be taken for granted. The event introduced rupture into historical consciousness, the idea that existence could be divided into before and after, with no guarantee of repair. This altered sense of time appears subtly in later traditions. Narratives become less cyclical and more conditional. Blessings are no longer assumed. They are contingent. Stability depends on behavior, vigilance, and favor. This shift does not emerge from philosophy alone. It grows from experience of abrupt loss. When a city vanishes overnight, the illusion of permanence collapses. History ceases to be a smooth flow and becomes a series of thresholds. Archaeological layers embody this change physically. Beneath the destruction horizon lie centuries of accumulation, floors rebuilt atop floors, walls repaired and extended. Above it lies absence. The stratigraphy itself becomes a visual metaphor for broken time. There is no gradual tapering, no transition. One layer ends, another does not begin for generations. The earth records a pause in human ambition. This pause shaped how later peoples related to ruins. Instead of viewing them merely as sources of reusable stone, they became charged spaces, places avoided or ritualized. Ruins are not neutral. They provoke imagination. They suggest warning. In the valley, the scale of abandonment amplified this effect. A ruined house might invite reuse. A ruined region inspires caution. The land itself became a monument to fragility. Texts written long after the event treat the ruins with reverence or dread. They are invoked as evidence that limits exist. Even powerful societies can be erased. This realization tempers triumphal narratives. It introduces restraint into how power is imagined. Kings and prophets alike reference past destruction to humble present ambition. The valley becomes a silent participant in political discourse. This influence extends to law and ethics. Codes emphasize protection of the vulnerable, limits on excess, warnings against arrogance. While these themes have multiple sources, the memory of absolute loss reinforces them. When people know what total erasure looks like, moderation acquires urgency. Ethics are no longer abstract ideals. They are survival strategies refined by memory. The role of witnesses becomes central in this framework. Those who survived or heard directly from survivors carried authority. Their accounts anchored truth in experience rather than doctrine. Over time, as first-hand witnesses vanished, texts took their place. Writing became a substitute for living memory. This transition elevated the importance of preservation. To forget became dangerous. The scribes who copied ancient laments understood this instinctively. They treated texts not as relics but as responsibilities. Copying was an act of renewal, ensuring that memory remained accessible. Errors crept in, language evolved, but the core endured. This endurance is not accidental. It reflects deliberate cultural investment in remembering what must not be repeated. Archaeology now participates in this chain of witness. Excavation is not merely discovery, it is reactivation. By exposing destruction layers, archaeologists restore visibility to moments long buried. They extend the lifespan of memory beyond text, grounding it in material reality. In doing so, they alter modern perceptions of the past, challenging assumptions that ancient stories are purely symbolic. The valley's destruction thus operates on two temporal axes. In its own time, it ended lives and reshaped landscapes. Across time, it reshaped how societies imagined continuity, responsibility, and risk. These effects ripple outward, influencing communities far removed from the original site. Memory does not respect geographic boundaries. It follows lines of communication and belief. Modern societies inherit this legacy unconsciously. We speak of worst-case scenarios, of points of no return, of existential threats. These concepts feel contemporary, yet they echo ancient realizations. The difference lies in scale and articulation, not essence. The valley taught that catastrophe need not be gradual to be real. That lesson persists. Archaeology reinforces this by demonstrating how quickly complex systems can fail. A city with infrastructure, governance, and economy can be rendered uninhabitable in moments. Recovery, if it comes at all, is slow and partial. This asymmetry between destruction and rebuilding is a constant in human history. Recognizing it counters narratives of inevitable progress. The temptation to view ancient catastrophes as unique aberrations diminishes under scrutiny. Geological records reveal repeated disruptions. Human records preserve selected memories of those disruptions. The valley stands out not because it was the only one, but because it was remembered so clearly. Memory elevated it above countless forgotten disasters. This elevation carries responsibility. Remembered catastrophes shape expectations. They inform planning, belief, and caution. When memory fades, vulnerability increases. The long abandonment of the valley demonstrates respect for memory. The eventual return shows its limits. Each generation balances inheritance against opportunity, often underestimating risks that predecessors feared. Understanding this dynamic reframes debates about ancient texts and modern science. The question is not whether ancient people explained events correctly, but whether they responded adaptively. In the case of the valley, they did. They fled. They avoided. They remembered. Their explanations, though theologically framed, preserved actionable knowledge. Modern societies face similar challenges with different tools. We model risks, track hazards, and debate probabilities. Yet we struggle with the same human tendencies: denial, normalization, forgetting. Ancient memory reminds us that ignoring low probability, high-impact events carries consequences disproportionate to their rarity. The valley's story thus transcends its archaeological context. It becomes a meditation on impermanence. It asks how societies incorporate the possibility of sudden loss into their self-understanding. Ancient cultures answered with myth, ritual, and cautionary tales. Modern cultures answer with data, models, and policies. Both approaches grapple with the same uncertainty. What archaeology contributes is perspective. It reveals that humanity has faced such uncertainty before and survived, not by mastering nature, but by respecting its unpredictability. The ruins testify to failure, but the continuity of culture testifies to resilience. Memory bridges the two. The destruction layer remains buried beneath wind and sand, but its implications surface repeatedly in human thought. Each time a city imagines itself invulnerable, the past whispers otherwise. Each time progress feels assured, the earth offers counterexamples. The valley does not shout, it endures. In recognizing this endurance, the story shifts from spectacle to lesson. Catastrophe is not merely an endpoint, it is a pivot that reshapes how time is understood, how responsibility is framed, and how survival is pursued. The ancient world learned this through fire and silence. The modern world encounters the lesson through excavation and reflection. The medium changes. The message remains. As the centuries accumulated, the catastrophe's imprint extended beyond history into identity. Communities defined themselves not only by what they built, but by what they avoided becoming. The memory of cities erased without warning fostered a cultural reflex toward humility, a suspicion of excess that lingered even as prosperity returned elsewhere. This reflex did not eliminate ambition, but it shaped its expression. Power became something to negotiate with, not assume as permanent. In later texts, this sensibility appears as tension between confidence and restraint. Cities are praised for strength, yet warned against arrogance. Kings are celebrated but reminded of limits. Prosperity is framed as conditional rather than inherent. These themes are not unique to one tradition, but their concentration in regions touched by catastrophic memory suggests reinforcement through lived experience. When the past demonstrates that collapse can arrive without precedent, caution becomes wisdom. Archaeological evidence supports this subtle shift. Monumental construction resumes in some areas, but often with modifications. Defensive planning becomes more sophisticated. Storage capacity increases, indicating concern for disruption. Urban layouts allow for quicker evacuation. These changes are not dramatic enough to attribute solely to a single cause, but they align with society's internalizing vulnerability. The valley's absence becomes a negative example shaping positive choices elsewhere. This internalization also affects how people interpret signs. Unusual natural phenomena gain significance. Eclipses, comets, and atmospheric anomalies are recorded carefully, sometimes anxiously. While ancient astronomy sought order in the heavens, catastrophe introduced disorder into expectation. The sky was no longer just a calendar. It was a potential messenger of danger. This duality reflects a worldview shaped by experience rather than abstraction. The transmission of this worldview relied on institutions capable of carrying memory across generations. Temples, schools, and later scriptural traditions served this function. They curated stories, selected which to preserve, and framed them for relevance. The destruction narratives survived because they continued to speak to contemporary concerns. Each generation found new meaning in them, adapting emphasis while retaining core imagery. This adaptability explains why the story did not fossilize. It remained dynamic, capable of addressing new crises. Droughts, invasions, and internal collapse could all be interpreted through the same lens of conditional stability. The ancient catastrophe provided a vocabulary for processing subsequent shocks. It became a cognitive tool, not just a historical reference. Archaeology, by contrast, freezes moments. It excavates what was, not how it was interpreted later. Yet even static remains tell stories of adaptation. Shifts in settlement density, changes in diet, variations in material culture all reflect responses to risk. These responses accumulate, forming patterns visible only across long spans of time. The valley's long abandonment stands out against this background as an extreme response to extreme conditions. When people eventually returned to the region, they did so cautiously. New settlements were smaller, more dispersed. They avoided the exact footprint of the ancient city, as if respecting an invisible boundary. This spatial memory suggests that the catastrophe was not forgotten, even if its details blurred. The land itself carried stigma, reinforced by stories and reinforced again by ecological difficulty. Such stigma plays a role in shaping landscapes long after physical danger subsides. Areas associated with disaster acquire reputations that persist beyond rational assessment. In modern contexts, this is seen in ghost towns and exclusion zones. In ancient contexts, the mechanism was narrative rather than signage. The effect, however, was similar. Memory regulated movement. This regulatory function of memory highlights an often overlooked aspect of ancient storytelling. It was not merely descriptive or moralizing. It was managerial. It guided decisions about where to live, how to build, and what risks to accept. In the absence of scientific forecasting, story served as risk assessment, crude but effective. Understanding this function helps resolve apparent contradictions in ancient texts. The same tradition that celebrates divine blessing also emphasizes sudden destruction. These are not inconsistencies. They are complementary. Blessing explains success. Destruction explains failure. Together they form a world-view capable of accommodating unpredictability. Modern readers sometimes mistake this accommodation for fatalism. In fact, it is pragmatic. By acknowledging that catastrophe can occur without warning, societies create space for preparedness and restraint. They avoid overinvestment in any single assumption. The valley's destruction reinforced this stance by providing a concrete example of overconfidence undone. The archaeological record reveals that such lessons were unevenly applied. Some regions absorbed them deeply, others ignored or forgot them, repeating patterns of risk. This unevenness reflects human diversity rather than failure of memory itself. Stories persist, but their influence varies with circumstance. Prosperity dulls caution. Scarcity sharpens it. The endurance of the catastrophe narrative across time demonstrates that, at least in some contexts, caution outlived comfort. The story remained relevant because it addressed a fundamental anxiety: the fear that everything built can be lost. This fear is not paralyzing when acknowledged. It becomes paralyzing only when denied. Archaeology, by reintroducing physical evidence into this narrative, challenges modern assumptions about ancient naivety. It shows that ancient people observed their world closely and responded intelligently within their constraints. Their explanations may not align with modern science, but their behavior often aligns with modern risk management principles. This alignment invites re-evaluation of how ancient knowledge is valued. Instead of dismissing it as pre-scientific, it can be understood as pre-technical but empirically grounded. The valley's destruction was not understood mechanistically, but its consequences were understood accurately enough to inform generations. The persistence of this understanding suggests that memory, when anchored in experience and reinforced by environment, can rival written data in durability. Stories carried across centuries preserved essential truths about risk and consequence. Archaeology now corroborates those truths, lending them new credibility without stripping them of meaning. The result is a richer picture of the past, one that resists simple categorization. Ancient societies were neither helpless victims nor omniscient prophets. They were adaptive communities navigating uncertainty with the tools available. Catastrophe sharpened those tools. The valley stands as a case study in this process. Its destruction was not merely an end, but a catalyst, reshaping thought, behavior, and belief far beyond its borders. The lessons drawn from it continue to surface whenever societies confront the limits of control. In recognizing this continuity, the ancient and modern worlds converge. Both grapple with the same dilemma: how to live productively in a world that can change without warning. The answers differ in form, but not in intent. Memory, whether carved into stone, pressed into clay, or read from soil, remains humanity's most enduring response to uncertainty. As the ancient catastrophe receded further into the past, its physical traces slowly softened under wind, rain, and human neglect. But its psychological imprint continued to shape how later societies interpreted danger. Over time, the ruined valley ceased to function only as a memory of destruction and began to operate as a boundary in the imagination, a reminder that not all spaces were meant to be reclaimed. This shift from historical event to symbolic frontier altered how people mapped risk onto the landscape. In many cultures, places associated with annihilation acquire a dual character. They are feared, yet they are also watched. Stories cluster around them. Travelers mention them. Teachers invoke them. The land becomes a reference point against which safety is measured. In the case of the valley, this role persisted long after its fields might have been marginally usable again. Even when environmental conditions improved, hesitation remained. Memory outlived necessity. Archaeological surveys reveal this hesitation indirectly. Settlement returns to the broader region occurred unevenly, favoring slopes and uplands over the plain itself. When people did reoccupy low areas, they did so tentatively, without reconstructing large urban centers. This pattern suggests that the land's reputation mattered as much as its productivity. People were not ignorant of improved conditions. They chose caution anyway. This choice reflects a deeper cognitive adaptation. Humans do not assess risk solely through present data. They rely on inherited narratives that compress complex histories into actionable guidance. In modern terms, these narratives function like heuristics, simplifying decision-making under uncertainty. The valley's story told people where danger once arrived without warning. That knowledge, though imprecise, reduced perceived safety and influenced behavior accordingly. Over generations, such heuristics become embedded in identity. Communities define themselves in contrast to what they are not. They are not the cities that ignored warning. They are not the people who lingered too long. This negative identity shapes values, emphasizing vigilance, moderation, and readiness to move. It also fosters a moral dimension to survival, where obedience to warnings is framed as virtue. Texts written centuries after the event reveal this moralization clearly. Destruction is linked not just to physical vulnerability, but to social failure. Cities fall because they forget limits. They become arrogant, unjust, or complacent. While these explanations reflect later ethical concerns, they also preserve a practical truth. Failure to respond appropriately to risk invites disaster. Moral language encodes pragmatic caution. Archaeology complicates this moralization by showing that the destroyed cities were not necessarily decadent or negligent. They were prosperous, organized, and strategically located. Their destruction does not appear to have been caused by internal collapse. This tension between moral narrative and material evidence highlights how memory evolves. Explanations shift even as core facts remain. The shift does not invalidate the narrative. It reveals its function. Moral framing ensures transmission. A story about ethical failure travels farther than one about random misfortune. It motivates attention and compliance. By linking catastrophe to behavior, societies create incentives to heed inherited warnings. The cost is distortion of causation. The benefit is survival. This trade-off is evident across ancient traditions. Flood stories, fire stories, and collapse stories often emphasize moral causality, even when physical triggers are evident. The pattern suggests a universal human strategy. Align memory with values to ensure persistence. The valley's destruction fits this pattern, transformed from geological event into ethical exemplar. Modern archaeology reopens the question of causation without undoing the narrative's utility. It restores physical context, reminding us that catastrophe can strike regardless of virtue. This restoration introduces humility into interpretation. It tempers moral certainty with awareness of contingency. It suggests that preparedness matters even in the absence of fault. This perspective aligns with contemporary risk science, which emphasizes resilience over blame. Modern societies increasingly recognize that disasters are shaped by exposure and vulnerability rather than moral worth. Ancient narratives, when reread through archaeological evidence, can be seen as early attempts to grapple with this reality using available frameworks. The valley thus becomes a meeting point between ancient and modern understandings of risk. Its story illustrates how societies adapt to uncertainty by blending observation with meaning. The blend evolves, but its purpose remains consistent: to reduce future harm by preserving past experience. The endurance of the story also reveals something about human attention. Not all catastrophes are remembered equally. Those that align with existing concerns or produce enduring environmental change are more likely to persist in memory. The valley's long-term abandonment reinforced its story, providing visible confirmation long after eyewitnesses were gone. The land itself became a storyteller. This self-reinforcing loop between environment and narrative strengthens memory. People believe the story because the land looks cursed. They avoid the land, ensuring it remains empty and reinforces the story. Breaking such loops requires strong counter-evidence, which may not arrive for centuries. Until then, memory governs behavior. The slow return to the valley reflects the gradual erosion of this loop. As new generations encountered less visible danger, confidence increased. Yet even then, full reoccupation did not occur. The ancient capital remained unreclaimed. Ruins persisted as anchors of caution, physical reminders that stories were rooted in reality. In modern times, excavation interrupts this dynamic by introducing new narratives grounded in science. The ruins are no longer only symbols, they are data. This shift does not erase the old stories, but reframes them. Fire from heaven becomes extreme heat. Divine wind becomes shockwave. Curse becomes salinization. The translation preserves meaning while updating mechanism. This translation process is ongoing and imperfect. It risks oversimplification in the opposite direction, stripping stories of their emotional truth. Effective interpretation requires holding both layers at once, the ancient experience and the modern explanation. Each illuminates the other. The valley's destruction, viewed through this lens, is neither pure myth nor solved case. It is a composite record of event, memory, adaptation, and reinterpretation. Its significance lies not only in what happened, but in how that happening reshaped human thought across time. By tracing this reshaping, archaeology reveals continuity where difference is often assumed. Ancient people did not ignore risk. They encoded it. They did not misunderstand catastrophe. They translated it. Their translations, though symbolic, preserved essential truths about vulnerability and consequence. The persistence of those truths challenges modern complacency. It reminds us that despite technological advancement, the fundamental relationship between humanity and its environment remains fragile. Rare events still occur. Memory still fades. Stories still matter. The valley endures as testimony to this fragility. Its silence speaks of limits learned the hard way. Its story, carried forward through centuries of retelling and reinterpretation, continues to shape how danger is imagined and avoided. In that continuity, the ancient and modern worlds are not separated by ignorance or enlightenment, but connected by shared vulnerability and the enduring human effort to remember what must not be forgotten. When the ancient catastrophe is viewed through the lens of long-term human behavior, a subtle but profound shift emerges in how societies conceptualize safety. Before the destruction, safety was largely spatial. Walls protected cities. Elevation offered advantage. Proximity to water ensured survival. Afterward, safety became temporal as well. Timing mattered. Being present at the wrong moment proved fatal regardless of strength or preparation. This realization altered how risk was perceived and narrated. Ancient stories emphasize urgency. Escape must be immediate. Hesitation equals death. Survival depends not on resistance, but on departure. These themes recur because they reflect lived experience. When destruction arrives faster than defense can respond, movement becomes the only viable strategy. This lesson, encoded in narrative, influenced how later communities imagined crisis response. Archaeological patterns support this emphasis on mobility. In periods following the catastrophe, settlements appear less rigidly centralized. Populations distribute themselves across multiple smaller sites, rather than concentrating in singular urban hubs. This dispersion reduces vulnerability to localized disasters. It also reflects a worldview shaped by awareness that concentration magnifies risk. Material culture mirrors this adaptation. Portable goods become more common. Storage vessels increase relative to monumental architecture. These changes suggest an orientation toward flexibility. People prepared not only to endure hardship, but to relocate if necessary. The memory of sudden annihilation made permanence suspect. This suspicion of permanence manifests in ideology as well. Texts caution against excessive attachment to place or wealth. They valorize readiness to leave over stubborn endurance. Such values contrast with earlier traditions that celebrated conquest and fortification. The shift does not eliminate pride in achievement, but tempers it with acceptance of impermanence. The valley's destruction also influenced how authority was framed. Leaders are no longer depicted solely as builders and defenders, but as guides responsible for recognizing danger and directing timely withdrawal. Failure to heed warnings becomes a mark of poor leadership. This emphasis aligns with archaeological evidence showing that survival depended on distance from the epicenter rather than on resistance. Over time, these ideas crystallized into cultural norms. Communities learned to read signs, to interpret unusual phenomena as potential precursors to disaster. While this sensitivity sometimes produced superstition, it also fostered attentiveness. Ignoring anomalies carried social risk. Listening to warnings became virtuous. The environment reinforced this attentiveness. The valley remained visibly altered long after the event. Saline patches, eroded ruins, and absence of cultivation served as constant reminders that danger could originate beyond human control. These visual cues sustained narrative urgency. The land itself insisted on caution. As centuries passed, the immediacy of memory faded, but its structural influence persisted. Stories were retold with emphasis on decisive moments. The past was framed as a series of turning points rather than gradual arcs. This framing shaped historical consciousness, encouraging societies to anticipate sudden change rather than assume continuity. Archaeology provides evidence of this anticipatory mindset in infrastructure. Later settlements often included multiple access routes, open layouts, and less reliance on single water sources. These features increase resilience to unexpected disruption. They suggest that communities internalized lessons about vulnerability even when they no longer remembered the original event clearly. This internalization complicates interpretations of ancient texts that emphasize divine command to flee. Such commands are often read as theological imperatives. Archaeological context reveals a pragmatic dimension. Flight saved lives. Obedience to warnings was not merely moral, but practical. The divine voice in the narrative may represent collective recognition of danger distilled into authoritative form. Modern disaster studies echo this insight. Early evacuation consistently reduces casualties. Delayed response increases them. The ancient narratives, stripped of supernatural framing, convey this principle with stark clarity. Their persistence across time underscores its importance. The valley's destruction thus becomes a case study in how catastrophic experience reshapes behavioral norms. It encourages societies to prioritize flexibility over fortification, responsiveness over resistance. These priorities do not guarantee safety, but they increase survival odds in uncertain environments. This reframing challenges romantic notions of ancient heroism defined by last stands and fortified defense. Instead, survival is associated with attentiveness, humility, and willingness to abandon even cherished structures. The ruins testify to the cost of assuming that strength alone ensures safety. Archaeology also reveals limits to this adaptation. Not all communities adopted dispersion. Some rebuilt in risky areas, attracted by resources and trade advantages. These choices reflect ongoing negotiation between risk and reward. Memory influences, but does not dictate behavior. Human ambition continually tests boundaries. The persistence of risk-taking does not negate the lesson. It highlights its complexity. People learn, forget, relearn, and reinterpret. Each cycle leaves traces in settlement patterns and narratives. The valley's story participates in this cycle, resurfacing whenever catastrophe challenges assumptions. Understanding this dynamic enriches interpretation of both archaeological and textual records. It shows that ancient narratives are not static prescriptions, but evolving responses to repeated encounters with vulnerability. They adapt emphasis as contexts change while retaining core insights. In the modern world, the same tension exists. Urbanization concentrates populations despite known risks. Technology promises control even as new vulnerabilities emerge. Ancient lessons about sudden change and the value of readiness remain relevant, though framed differently. The valley's destruction offers perspective rather than prescription. It reminds us that safety is not a fixed state achieved through construction alone. It is a process requiring awareness, adaptability, and respect for forces beyond control. Ancient societies learned this through loss. Modern societies encounter it through data and simulation. Archaeology bridges these experiences by grounding abstract principles in tangible evidence. It shows how sudden catastrophe reshapes behavior long after physical danger passes. It reveals continuity in human responses across millennia. The ruins stand not as relics of ignorance, but as markers of learning. They embody a transition from confidence in permanence to acceptance of impermanence. This transition influenced how people built, moved, and remembered. In the end, the valley's significance lies in this transformation. Its destruction did not merely end a city. It altered how safety was understood, shifting emphasis from walls to timing, from defense to decision. That shift, encoded in story and confirmed by material record, continues to inform human responses to danger, reminding us that survival often depends not on what we build, but on when we choose to leave. As the narrative of destruction approaches its furthest horizon, what remains is not the event itself, but the question of inheritance. How does a civilization carry forward knowledge of catastrophe without becoming trapped by fear? The ancient valley offers a rare window into this balance, showing how memory can both protect and constrain. Over time, the story ceased to function solely as warning and became a measure of perspective, a way to situate human effort within a larger, unpredictable reality. Later generations who encountered the story no longer lived under the shadow of immediate danger. For them, the ruins were distant, the soil less hostile, the catastrophe abstract. Yet the narrative retained power because it addressed a universal vulnerability. It reminded listeners that progress does not erase risk. No amount of skill or organization guarantees immunity from sudden change. This realization tempered ambition without extinguishing it. Archaeological evidence supports this nuanced inheritance. Regions influenced by the catastrophe did not retreat into permanent minimalism. They rebuilt, traded, and expanded. But they did so with altered expectations. Cities grew again, yet often avoided the exact configurations that had proven fatal. Networks diversified, dependencies were spread across regions rather than concentrated. This pattern suggests learning rather than paralysis. Texts echo this balance. They celebrate renewal while maintaining caution. Restoration follows destruction, but it is framed as gift rather than entitlement. Prosperity returns, yet remains conditional. This framing encourages gratitude and vigilance rather than complacency. The catastrophe thus becomes a reference point, not to prevent growth, but to guide it. The persistence of the story across millennia also speaks to humanity's need to contextualize suffering. Catastrophe without meaning threatens coherence. By embedding the event within a broader moral or cosmic framework, societies preserved psychological stability. The narrative offered reassurance that destruction was not arbitrary, even if the explanation was symbolic. This reassurance mattered for continuity. Modern readers often critique such explanations as evasions. From a psychological standpoint, they function as coping mechanisms. They allow communities to absorb trauma without fracturing. Archaeology reveals the cost of the trauma. Narrative reveals how people lived with that cost. The valley's destruction also influenced how people imagined the end of things. Apocalyptic language appears in later traditions, drawing on imagery established by this and similar events. Fire, darkness, sudden upheaval become metaphors for ultimate transformation. These metaphors resonate because they are rooted in experience. They transform historical memory into eschatological imagination. This transformation does not imply expectation of repetition. Rather, it acknowledges possibility. The end is imaginable because it has happened before, on smaller scales. The valley taught that worlds can end locally even if the cosmos continues. This insight reshaped how time and destiny were conceived. Archaeology grounds this insight by showing that local ends are common. Civilizations rise and fall repeatedly. What distinguishes the valley is the abruptness and completeness of its fall. That completeness made it memorable. It also made it useful as a conceptual boundary for imagining limits. The endurance of the narrative demonstrates that humans do not remember catastrophes merely to fear them. They remember them to orient themselves. Memory provides contrast. It clarifies what is fragile and what is resilient. In the valley's case, resilience lay not in walls or wealth, but in the capacity to move, adapt, and remember. This capacity persists today. Modern disaster planning emphasizes redundancy, mobility, and communication. These principles mirror ancient adaptations encoded in story. The tools differ. The logic remains. Archaeology's contribution is to validate ancient experience without endorsing ancient explanations. It affirms that the catastrophe was real and transformative. It leaves open the precise mechanism while narrowing possibilities. This openness invites continued inquiry rather than closure. The temptation to resolve the mystery definitively remains strong. Humans prefer answers to questions, especially those charged with existential weight. Yet some events resist complete resolution. Their complexity exceeds available data. Accepting this limitation is part of maturity, both personal and cultural. The valley's story thus teaches restraint in interpretation as well as action. It warns against overconfidence, whether in divine favor or technological mastery. It encourages humility grounded in evidence. As excavation continues and analytical techniques improve, new details may emerge. They may refine models or challenge assumptions, but they will not erase the core truth. A thriving region was destroyed suddenly, its people displaced, its land altered, its memory preserved. That preservation is itself an achievement. Countless other catastrophes have vanished from record. The valley survived in story and soil because its impact was undeniable and its consequences enduring. Memory attached itself to visible absence and persisted. In the modern world, where information is abundant yet attention fleeting, this persistence offers a lesson. What endures is not the volume of data, but the relevance of meaning. The valley's story endured because it addressed a fundamental human concern: how to live with uncertainty. Archaeology allows us to revisit that concern with clarity. It strips away some layers of interpretation while revealing others. It does not diminish the story's power. It enhances it by anchoring it in reality. The final inheritance of the catastrophe is therefore not fear, but awareness. Awareness that progress is contingent. Awareness that stability is negotiated, not guaranteed. Awareness that memory is a tool for survival. As the ruins continue to erode and the land slowly heals, the story remains, carried forward in texts, in research, and in reflection. It no longer belongs solely to the ancient world. It speaks to any society that builds, trusts, and hopes. The valley's destruction does not demand despair. It invites perspective. It asks us to recognize that civilizations are not judged by whether they fall, but by how they remember, adapt, and rebuild. In that sense, the ancient catastrophe achieves a final transformation, from event to warning, from warning to guide, from guide to shared human insight. Fire faded, walls collapsed, names became symbols, but the lesson endured. Survival depends not on denying vulnerability, but on acknowledging it and choosing wisely in its shadow. At the far edge of this long memory, where ruins thin into dust and stories blur into inheritance, the catastrophe resolves into something quieter but no less demanding: responsibility. Not responsibility in the sense of blame, but responsibility to witness. The ancient scribes who pressed their grief into clay did not expect to be believed forever. They expected to be read. They understood that meaning survives not through certainty, but through transmission. The ground they left behind continues that work. Long after walls fell and names shifted, the soil retained its testimony. Melted surfaces, fractured stone, and sterile layers do not argue. They persist. Archaeology does not grant them voice so much as remove the silence covering them. Each excavation is an act of listening, an acknowledgement that the past still has unfinished business with the present. What emerges from this listening is not a single conclusion, but a pattern of humility. The destruction was real. Its mechanism remains debated. Its consequences were profound. These facts coexist without requiring resolution. In accepting that coexistence, modern inquiry mirrors ancient restraint. Both recognize limits. Both resist the urge to force coherence where evidence permits only alignment. The ancient world responded to catastrophe by encoding it into memory systems capable of surviving disruption. Story, ritual, and taboo carried forward what could not be rebuilt. Modern societies respond by modeling risk, archiving data, and building redundancies. The methods differ, but the objective is shared: to reduce the cost of surprise. The Valley's story challenges the assumption that knowledge alone prevents disaster. Ancient people observed carefully, yet still suffered loss. Modern societies model extensively, yet remain vulnerable. The lesson is not that preparation is futile, but that preparation has boundaries. Some forces exceed prediction. Some events arrive without warning. Awareness does not guarantee safety, but ignorance guarantees exposure. In this sense, the catastrophe offers a sober corrective to narratives of mastery. Human history is not a straight ascent from vulnerability to control. It is a negotiation, renewed in each generation, between capability and contingency. The Valley marks a moment when contingency prevailed utterly, forcing recalibration. That recalibration left traces in belief, behavior, and landscape. It influenced where people settled, how they built, and what they valued. It shaped language and metaphor. It entered law and ethics. These secondary effects may outlast the physical event itself. They demonstrate how deeply catastrophe can reorganize thought. Modern engagement with the site extends this reorganization. It asks contemporary societies to confront their own assumptions about permanence. Cities today are larger, denser, and more interconnected than any ancient settlement. Their vulnerability, though differently distributed, is no less real. The Valley's lesson is not antiquarian. It is contemporary. Archaeology does not issue warnings. It provides context. It shows that sudden loss has precedent, that recovery is uneven, and that memory matters. It also shows that human societies adapt. They do not simply vanish. Even when cities are erased, culture persists, transformed. The ancient scribes understood this. Their laments do not end with despair alone. They record loss, but they also preserve continuity through language. By naming what was destroyed, they refused total erasure. Naming is an act of resistance against oblivion. Modern research continues that resistance. By correlating text with material evidence, it restores complexity to stories often reduced to symbol or skepticism. It affirms that ancient accounts deserve neither blind belief nor casual dismissal. They deserve engagement. Engagement requires patience. It accepts that some questions will remain open. It values convergence over closure. It recognizes that understanding emerges through accumulation rather than revelation. The Valley has taught this lesson repeatedly, as each new study refines rather than resolves the picture. At the close of this exploration, certainty would be an inappropriate offering. What can be offered instead is clarity about stakes. The catastrophe mattered because it reshaped lives, landscapes, and legacies. It mattered because it was remembered. It matters still because it confronts us with the fragility we prefer to forget. The ruins do not ask us to fear the sky or mistrust the ground. They ask us to acknowledge limits. They ask us to remember that safety is provisional, that progress carries risk, and that memory is a form of preparedness. Ancient narratives framed this acknowledgement in moral and cosmic terms. Modern inquiry frames it in probabilistic and environmental terms. Both converge on the same insight. The world does not guarantee continuity. Continuity must be negotiated with humility and awareness. The Valley's silence today is deceptive. It is not empty of meaning. It is saturated with it. Every absence speaks of presence lost. Every shard testifies to lives interrupted. Every layer marks a decision point between memory and forgetting. To remember is not to dwell endlessly on disaster. It is to integrate its lesson into how we live. Ancient societies did this through story. Modern societies do it through research and planning. Both approaches require commitment across generations. The final inheritance of the catastrophe, then, is not a solved mystery, but an enduring obligation. To study without sensationalism. To remember without distortion. To build without assuming invulnerability. To leave records that future generations can interpret with greater clarity than we possess now. The ancient scribes pressed their words into clay, knowing it might last. They were right. The clay endured. The cities did not. That contrast is the quiet heart of the story. What survives is not stone or fire, but attention. Attention to evidence, attention to memory, attention to the possibility that the past still has something urgent to say. In honoring that attention, the modern world does not merely analyze ancient catastrophe. It participates in the same human project that began when the first witness decided not to forget. The valley's story continues not because it is complete, but because it remains unfinished, inviting each generation to listen, to learn, and to remember that even in silence, the ground speaks.